Hello, everyone. Um, it's not intimidating at all to be sitting next to Kumi, someone who started at the age of 15, right? Being an activist against apartheid. And it's been, how long? 40 years, 45 years? 45 years of activism, of struggle, starting from the most basic human rights issue, which is apartheid, to one that you think, is one of the most important challenge facing us, all of us, in this modern age. So, Kumi.
Thank you, Ghaith. You could have introduced me slightly differently. You could have said, this guy has been around for more than 45 years fighting the good fight, but he actually has very little to show for it, because we are seeing setbacks on human rights, setbacks on climate change, setbacks on gender equality, setbacks on LGBTIQ. So it's important to start with my own reading of my life is that we have won some very important battles for justice on all those areas I mentioned and more, but we are losing the overall war for justice. So if we are fighting in the Amazon, for example, we might protect a part of the Amazon forest, and that's great, but we must be honest with ourselves and tell no lies and claim no easy victories, that our intention was to protect the entire Amazon or any other forest, and we are not succeeding.
You say we're losing the bigger war, but you started as a teenager fighting apartheid, and you won that battle. You won that battle and you won that war. What turned the human rights fighter into fighting for against climate change? How do you? Is it two separate topics? One human rights and one climate and science and the disasters we're facing, or both are the same issue of justice?
This is such an important question, right? Because I'll tell it as a story. So I became the head of Greenpeace in 2009. And in my first month in that role, I had to speak to journalists from different countries around the world. And the main question they all asked me was, so you've been in the fight for human rights, democracy, gender equity all these years. Why are you leaving those fights now to go to the fight on climate change and environmental justice? And my answer then and my answer now is that the struggle to avert catastrophic climate change and the struggle to protect human rights, democracy, and so on must, can, and should be seen as two sides of the same coin. And one of the reasons we have not won on climate is because we failed to do that. We made it sound as if, in fact, one of the biggest mistakes we made on climate, two mistakes. One is we framed the struggle to address the climate issue as an environmental issue. Climate change is not an environmental issue. It is a failure of our economic system, our energy system, our food system, our transport system, and so on. So what we did was, by talking about it as environment, and I should be honest with you, growing up in apartheid South Africa, environmental justice, we grew up understanding it's what white people and rich people did, right? You know, that was how it was framed. But the second thing is, 86% of the cause of climate change is our dependency on fossil fuels, right? 86%, right, of what drives climate change. And the mistake we made was we went after fossil fuels, oil, coal, and gas, by saying it is bad because it causes climate change. It's true, it's bad because it's climate change, but what we've just seen in Iran now is it's also bad because it's the biggest driver historically and currently of war and conflict. It's also bad because it promotes health risks and brings down health statistics. It's also bad because it exploits women in the industry and doesn't treat them well. So those are two mistakes that we made. And for me, the struggle for human rights, democracy, and so on, and the struggle for climate justice is one and the same thing. They're just two sides of a different coin. Thanks.
So I think you want to ask the audience a question.
Yes, so we thought we'll bring you all in, right? And I thought because it's quite arbitrary, right? If you think about it, we both could be sitting in the audience and any one or two of you could be up here having a conversation. So we wanted to bring you in and get your knowledge into the conversation. So we are going to put up a question which is not coming up. Hopefully it'll come up soon, but while it's coming up, there we go. So I'll stand up for this, okay? Don't look at that at the moment, just look at me. So the question is, how is humanity addressing the climate challenge that we have? I'm going to give you three options. So the next, let's see if it works now. Oops. So option one is, no reason to panic. Things are largely on track. We can trust our government and business leaders to get their acts together and avert the worst of catastrophic climate change, recognizing that we are already seeing impacts right now. And the scientists use three words. We need to avert catastrophic, runaway, irreversible climate change. And we are in the first phases of that catastrophe, as I'm sure you are seeing with deaths in the summer and flooding and so on. Option two, you feel that the challenge is massive and the window of opportunity is fast closing, but you still hold the view that it's within human creativity, ingenuity, and courage that we can broaden that opportunity and take us away from the suicidal trajectory that humanity currently is. And option three, if I can use an Afrikaans sentence, a language derived from Dutch in South Africa, I'll say it in Afrikaans. Option three is, ons is deep, deep, deep in the kak. I hope it didn't require any translation, which is, okay, so those of you who think it's option one, please raise your hand. Okay, nobody. By the way, 10 years ago, there would be about 5 to 10% of the audience that would put up their hands for option one. Now you never see anybody, because I think the writing is on the wall. Okay, option two. Look around, those of you who don't have your hands up also, just to see, how many people. Okay, option three. Okay, so if I want to be honest with you, there are days when I wake up that it's option two. There are days when I wake up, it's option three. For sure, the day Trump got elected, it was option 3.5. So I just want to end with this message, this section, right? In the moment of history that we find ourselves in, pessimism is a luxury we simply cannot afford. And the pessimism that justifiably emerges from our analysis, our lived experiences, and our observations can, must, and should be responded to by the optimism of our thought, our action, our creativity, our courage, our sense of humanity. And that is why events like the Zeg Festival are so critically important, because it's creating space for us to have the kinds of conversations where we speak in a more human way, rather than we speak in a way where we try to pretend, as many climate activists do, that we are scientists, and we use all sorts of jargon that 99% of the world barely understands what we are talking about.
So I have to confess, I am an eternally pessimist Arab, so I am beyond 3, I am 5 or something. But let me challenge you on this optimism factor, and I want to go back to your struggle against apartheid. One of the main tools of which led to the defeat of apartheid was the boycott, divestment, boycotting white South Africa until it kind of broke it. Is this model still possible for the fossil fuels? I tell you why I'm asking this question, because yesterday we sat in a session by an opposition leader from Venezuela, a human rights, a person we all admire his courage and something, and he sat in the audience and said, to solve the problems of Venezuela, we have to pump more oil. So how do we reconcile these things? How do we, I come from a country that is based on oil, and I've seen the civil wars and the destruction, environmental and otherwise, caused by oil. How do we reconcile these two things? How do we tell the people oil is killing you? If not now, in 10 years, in 15 years, it's killing the whole planet, and at the same time, struggle for the... How do you reconcile these two things?
So, to answer the question of how to do it, the short answer is with extreme difficulty. And let's admit that we're talking about something that's really complicated. But the important thing to know is that the people that knew that oil, coal, and gas would have the consequences of what we have, which scientists, anybody knows who the scientists of which companies knew first? It was fossil fuel companies. So, for example, if you look at when they were building rigs in the sea, they were lifting up the size of the rigs because they knew that already you would start seeing sea level rise. Okay, so how do we do it? So basically, we either accept the science or we don't accept the science. The science is very clear. The driver of climate change is our dependency on oil, coal, and gas. We've known this for a long time, and here's the absurd thing. For 30 years, we've been having these COPs, you might have heard of, Congress, Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. For 30 years, we go to these meetings, and because it's supposed to be consensus made, everybody has to agree, every country has to agree. So Saudi Arabia, Russia, the US, and others come there and say, we cannot mention fossil fuels. So that's, and we only succeeded 1 year, 3 years ago in Doha, to even get fossil fuels mentioned in this, the weakest language possible. So imagine that for a moment, right? That's like Alcoholics Anonymous holding 30 years of conferences, but they don't have a backbone to mention alcohol in the outcome document. That is why we have seen a small breakthrough, right? And the small breakthrough is that finally, when again we failed in the Amazon last year in the COP, we then pushed really hard as the fossil fuel treaty initiative, where we have already 18 countries that have said to the world, we need to start negotiating a binding treaty that gets us on a pathway to get out of this mess, right? And by the way, 3 of those countries are fossil fuel exporters. Colombia is the 5th largest coal exporter in the world, Timor-Leste, East Timor, and Pakistan. But Colombia is saying, just like Venezuela and Iraq be saying, we understand that we have our dependency on fossil fuels at the moment. We cannot transition overnight. We have to have a plan. And the only way we can have a plan is if we can get countries around the table to actually agree a way forward. So right now, we have to fight on many fronts, but we also have to recognize something that Ghaith will bring into the conversation later. We keep thinking that the solutions are only going to come from these global things. But actually, to be honest with you, over history, when we look at it, the best ideas don't come from the top. It actually comes from the bottom of society, and it's up to us to take those and run with it. So I would say that the good news is we have the scientific knowledge, we have the technological capability. All that is missing is political will. And the political will is hard because, like if you take an African country, I was just in Ghana and Kenya recently, right? And both those countries are seeing significant climate impacts now. But both those countries have fossil fuels as part of the revenue, right? And we had a whole dialogue in Ghana, for example, with 150 people, including the oil and gas industry. And at the end of that day, when we looked at the science, Ghanaian scientists presenting the science, the folks from the oil and gas company said, well, we can't argue with what is being presented, but we hope you'll not rush us. It needs to be done in a planned way. And that's why we need a plan. Because I'll just end with a reflection on the current bet we've all made. Whether you know or not, your governments have made that bet for you, right? Which is that the COP process will deliver a result. So think about it. We've been for more than 10 years calling for a fab deal. Not a fabulous deal, but a fair, ambitious, and binding deal, so that governments can't come go make blah, 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 and then go home and carry on as business as usual. But what we've been getting for the last 30 years is FLAB outcomes, FLAB, which stands for full of loopholes and bullshit, right? And unless we address the fact that we've got leaders in power today. Can I end with one thing about Iraq, if I might? Yeah. So this is part fiction and part true. When the US and its so-called coalition of the willing were about to attack Iraq in 2003. So, you know, the media establishment in the US, you might know that war in US media terms and Western media terms was ultimately described as Operation Iraqi Freedom. Anybody remembers that phrasing? Operation Iraqi Freedom. And where many journalists were embedded with the troops, and I don't know exactly where they were embedded and how far they were embedded, because quite often they were like completely lying about a lot of things. So, but you know what it was originally called? In the policymakers, they were calling it Operation Iraqi Liberation. And then somebody said, hey, no, we can't call it Operation Iraqi Liberation because it would be too obvious. Because Operation O, Iraqi I, Liberation L, would have spelled oil. There's no question that war was about oil. What's happening now is about oil. And unless we're willing to call out our leaders, we ourselves become complicit. And that is why the good news is we've got momentum now to putting pressure on fossil fuels, which if we don't solve climate change.
Beautiful, beautiful. But I'm going to push back again. I was looking at some charts and how much the US made out of Operation Iran Freedom recently, because the oil sales, the gas and oil sales in the US, actually the revenues jumped massively. We are living in a time where autocracy rules. We are seeing the civil space, the space for demonstrations, the space for activism in the street being closed, being criminalized, using technology, using cameras, face recognition to go after activists in the streets and all this thing. So you say the solution should come from the base, not from the top, because the top is failing us. How do we do this in a time when we are seeing these autocratic regimes ruling? And can we use the model that you guys used in South Africa, demonstrations again and again and again, because we're talking about divestment as a way that toppled South Africa, but you struggled on the streets. Can we see this? I mean, we're seeing few of these kind of organizations that already calling for, let's say, violence or something. How do we bring the people to the street to demonstrate or to take action against oil corporations?
So, thank you. This is another critical question. Yes, it is possible. But I think sometimes what happens in activism, and I think this is a moment that calls on all of us who have been involved in the struggles to be very self-critical. This is not a moment to talk about our legacies and what have you, right? Because if our legacies were so great, we won't be in such deep crisis right now, right? So the first thing is to recognize that in the activist toolbox, there are many things in it. It's marches, it's good research, it's policy, it's civil disobedience, and so on. But like any other thing that you try to do, let's say a mechanic is trying to fix a car, you need to know, depending on what the situation you're going to find when you open that engine, which tool to use, right? So let me give you an example of an organization I support, but who I believe made a tactical error, and it's an example you would have lived through in London, right? So in October 2020, Extinction Rebellion was on its peak, right? It was rising, it was getting lots of people out and so on. And they were really capturing the imagination. They forced the UK government into declaring the climate change, climate emergency and so on. But one of the protests that they did was outside the underground tube stations, right? So what you had was people blocking tube stations, right? But think about the dynamics of that. Largely, you got white, middle-class, privileged people taking part in the demonstrations, and working-class people using the tubes. If those working-class people who are in much larger numbers, if we cannot win them over, we are being completely crazy to think we're going to actually win, right? So I came out and said, civil disobedience is a legitimate tactic, but you use it from time to time. But you paint a picture which, to be honest, I don't really know the answer to how we deal with it. Because the biggest failure of activism, and all our efforts, whether you want to call it activism, philanthropy, whatever space you're in, our biggest failure is that we cannot communicate the moment that we are in, the urgency that we are in a way that's accessible and understandable and moves ordinary people who are time poor, who have very little leisure time to even read a newspaper or watch something because people are doing 2-3 jobs just to put food on the table and so on. So we need, and just to take anybody from France here? Okay, no. Okay, but there was a controversial sociologist, but brilliant at his time when he was at his peak, called Louis Althusser. And Althusser said one of the biggest mistakes we make is that we think that governments and corporations control us, mainly through the deployment of what he called the repressive state apparatus, by which he meant army, police, formal laws, and so on. But what he then went on to say, well, while that's important and determines the parameters of civic life, the biggest threat we face is not actually the repression, being shot and killed and put in prison. The biggest threat we face is the ideological state apparatus. And how we define that is the framework for education, the framework for religion, the framework for the funding of arts and culture, and the framework for communications and media, right? And if you look at it, right now, who controls all those mediums? I mean, between Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk, and by the way, thank you, America, for taking Elon Musk from us. The power they have, or Rupert Murdoch. I mean, in UK, the Labour Party has to go meet Tony Blair got elected because he went and made a deal with Rupert Murdoch so that his tabloids would not. This is not democracy. We must also question whether, in fact, what we're living under and what's been called democracy is meaningful democracy if some tech giants have actually captured our system. So, part of the challenge, I think, is we have to broaden the base of who feels comfortable. And if I may just close on a personal reflection here. So, after Archbishop Desmond Tutu died in South Africa, our son, who was a very popular musician, sits us down and says to us, guys, you're really not good at what you'll do. You've been fighting for democracy, human rights, gender justice, and all since we were teenagers. When I look at the world, it's all moving in the wrong direction. So why don't you just chill, spend the time you should have spent with us when you're unsuccessfully running around the world trying to save it? So we say to him, well, why is it you think we are failing? And then he says, it's very simple. It's totally simple. And he said, because you'll aim all your messages and the narratives at the brain, and you'll ignore the heart, the body, and the soul. And then he evokes Trump and said, look at Trump. He bypasses the brain, he goes straight to the heart and weaponizes all sorts of identity, hatred, and so on to mobilize people. So we asked him, do you want us to lie like Trump does? And then he said, no, I'm just saying you don't have to be so boring with the truth. Because when I've been walking past your Zoom calls over the last decade, I know you're speaking English, but it sounds like you're speaking a dialect that like no more than 100 people in the world understand what you're talking about. And just to close the loop on it, on his past, after that conversation, 6 weeks later, he died by suicide. And we set up a foundation called the Ricky Rick Foundation for the Promotion of Artivism, and we're building this global artivism movement. Because at the end of the day, we're only going to win this if we have people behind us. And right now, we are not messaging on climate in a people-centric way. And having said all of that, you are right. There is no guarantee that we're going to turn things around. If anyone of you had $100 that you want to bet, and the bet was, will we address climate change or will we not? We're going to fail. I would not advise you to bet that we're going to win. But I still believe that human creativity, ingenuity, and so on can turn things around. It depends whether we can mobilize and get the message to sufficient numbers of people.
Thank you, Kumi. That's heart-touching. I want to take this point further. So climate change is affecting all of us on planet Earth, everyone, whether they're right-wing, whether they're white supremacists, whether they're black or Arab or a Jew, everyone is being affected. Part of the message, the Trump message, for example, the right-wing message, whatever we want to call it, a certain part of the population who will be affected by climate change, who affected right now by climate change, will go and vote someone like Trump into power who promises more oil, more digging, more disaster. Why can't we, people in this room, go and talk to someone, to a farmer, sorry to say, a white farmer from whatever in America, and say, by electing this right way, you are causing this. Where is the failure in communication? Why can't we take the climate, I'm asking, the climate question, rhetoric, discipline, as your late son was talking about, and turn it into someone everyone agrees upon, regardless of their politics or what they think?
That's because we have approached the question of climate change as an environmental issue. We need to start talking about it. It's an issue about water. It's an issue about land. It's an issue about food. It's an issue about jobs. And the fact that we have not messaged it in that way. And at the end of the day, it's a message about securing our children and their children's future. So if any of you are getting depressed by this conversation about how deep a crisis we are in, there is some good news. And the good news is the planet actually is fine. The planet does not need saving. Because if we continue on the pathway that we're on, we destroy our water resources, our soil resources, it gets so hot we cannot plant food, as is happening in some parts of Africa right now. The end result is we will be gone, the planet will still be here. And the good news is once we all become extinct, the forests will recover, the oceans will grow back, and so on. So understand that the struggle is not about saving some ethereal thing called the planet. The struggle to avert catastrophic climate change is nothing more and nothing less than protecting our children and their children's futures. So part of what Trump is able to succeed on is the fact that we have a deeply unjust economic system where people at the top, the 1%, suck up so much of resources that the majority of people have crumbs. And when those crumbs are so few, and some politician says, hey, I can make your gas price less by getting more oil or pumping more oil or drill, baby, drill, right? They see it as a solution to a very immediate thing. And this is a problem about how climate change has been talked about. We always talk about it is like something going to happen in the future. And we need to bring back the narrative to the moment of how already things are changing. And we should do it with much more humility, much more creativity. Also, we should do it in a way where activists don't do what we've done all these years. When we, like say when I was head of Greenpeace and Amnesty, if I was put in front of an audience, I was briefed in a way that I had to speak to the audience where I had to say, folks, we know what needs to be done. We need to do A, B, C. And all you need to do is just join us and follow what we are saying. But imagine if I went to people and said, on climate, we need to reduce emissions, we need to increase gender equality, we need to improve democracy, whatever. That's the direction we need to go. Please join us and help us co-create the answers to that question, because actually nobody is sitting with a detailed solution of step by step what we want to do. The second approach, I would argue, is one which is an invitation for people to become active agents in what affects their lives and their children's lives, rather than what activism has been about, which is, hey, just support us, come and join us once in a while, and everything's going to be okay. You cannot outsource your conscience to any NGO, however good they are. You have to take on the responsibility of defending your children and grandchildren, because in years from now, not decades, years from now, your children and grandchildren, those of us who are older, are going to ask us, when the science was clear, what did you do? And we better have good answers, even if we are failing, to say, we are failing, but I did my bit and I tried. And we have not got that message across, and I believe we need to do so urgently.
It's very beautiful. So to talk about climate justice, we need to talk about social justice. Everything to it, which takes us back to the point when you started. Questions? Questions, please.
Oh, is that working?
Yes, let's collect the questions and then we'll answer them. So,
thank you. So, Jeremy Hillman, I really enjoyed. We met last night, Kumi. I used to lead communications at the World Bank, and I was at Gates Foundation before then. I found this conversation a little frustrating, to be honest, and I think a lot of your advocacy, Kumi, has been vital and necessary to get us to this point. I'm not sure it's the message that is needed to get us from this point to where we need to go. I would like to see and end this session with everybody putting up their hand for question 2 and working out how we get from question 2 to question 1, not question 3 to question 3.5. If you look at this incredible re-engineering there's been in the global economy and politically, half of all renewable capacity, now renewable energy capacity globally is renewable. 85% of energy, newly installed energy, is renewable. There's been an incredible victory from the advocacy that's happened. If you look at the political and legal frameworks, if you look at the huge, decline of green tech costs rapidly, outpacing any fossil fuel costs. So there's been huge progress. There is a mountain to climb. You're absolutely right about that. And it's certainly not guaranteed we're going to get there. But I would like to hear more optimism, more celebration of what we have achieved through this advocacy of the last decade. And if you look at the trillions of dollars going in from impact investment funds, sovereign wealth funds, the multilateral system, we've completely changed the dynamic. Lots and lots to do, but everybody should be putting their hands up for answer 2. And we shouldn't see anybody, hopefully, if we get this right through the communications and the messaging, putting their hands up for number 3.
After Zeg, if you have some time, come with me to Baghdad and I'll take you to Basra. And let's see that optimism striking. You will see the smoke coming from the oil field. You see the cancer rate rising. And so I would love it. I would like to. Question number 2, one there, and then we'll take that. We'll take 2 more questions, and then, yeah.
Is it on? Yeah. I'm not sure it's a question, but it's sort of following the first one is, I'm German, married to a Dane. And I think the problem is a bit more complex, which is why I didn't put my hand up at all, because most days I agree. I get up in the morning and think we are doomed. But being German right now is an interesting thing in the sense that we used to have a green energy minister that was voted out, and now we have a party back that got us into dependent on fossil fuels in the first place. And you think, God, we are going in the wrong direction. But because of the wars we are in, Iran and Ukraine, Germans are going out and installing solar cells on their balconies in troves because it's simply cheaper than what they would have to spend otherwise. What I'm trying to say is, yes, on maybe government levels and higher levels, we seem to be failing, but on the ground, I'm not sure that's true, as the gentleman before me has pointed out, is because it's simply cheaper to the renewable energy has gotten so much cheaper, people are switching, and we are winning, like in times of this, because governments are messing up so much, people say we have to find alternatives that you've been advocating for decades. And I think the picture is much more complex.
Yes. And to add one line to this before we take the third question, the greenest two cities I've been to recently is Beirut and Sana'a. Because with the failure of the states, everything collapsing, the electrical grid is collapsing, every surface in Beirut, vertical or horizontal, is covered by solar panels. And people just forgo that. Just there. Question number 3.
Hi. First of all, thank you for being here in Tbilisi. We very much appreciate your presence and all the speakers and everybody who has come. I'm Kate from Georgia, and let me dig a bit deeper than in climate story, because we told you so goes, I think, beyond, including democracy and human rights and everything we have kind of ended up. I loved what you mentioned about, we fail in times of crisis in communications. And that we need people behind, and not only in climate war, but I think in every other area that we are kind of as a civic activists are fighting in. You also mentioned that there is many tools in civic activism that we are not maybe using effectively. Can I ask you from your experience, what would you say apart from the street protests, or what is the tools that you would say we need today to make sure that we use in our arsenal that we have as a civic activists, as peaceful protesters, how we can make our messages across? How do we go from messages from here to heart? Can you share some of your stories? Thank you.
So, the point that activism actually has been achieving something, local initiatives, and
So, firstly, I'm sorry that you were frustrated by the session. That wasn't our intention to make you frustrated, but of course, when I say we're winning battles and losing the war, you're referring to the battles that we won, right? So let me just flip that around. The science says we need to keep warming below 1.5 degrees. Are people familiar with that statistic, right? So people in the Pacific who have contributed least to the problem, they are chanting already from 2015. When I was there, I learned a chilling slogan where people were saying 1.5 to stay alive, 1.5 to stay alive. I meet them 6 months later at the Paris climate negotiations in December 2015, and they invite me to a thing, and I think, let me shout the slogan they taught me 6 months earlier. And they go like this, no, the slogan has changed. And the new slogan was 1.5, we might survive. 1.5, we might survive. So, let me ask you, where are we now in terms of 1.5? Just shout the answer out. Where are we? Sorry? So we are there, right? Some say we are slightly over, some say we're lightly below. So the question is, that is the judgment. If we treated the scientists during COVID as mullahs and priests and archbishops, whenever they told us we need to do this, we slavishly went and did that. When the science are telling us we must not reach the target, why is it that we say, no, it's going to be fine? So I have worked very hard in Germany as well, by the way, advocating for that transition that you're talking about. These are good science, but even when you talk about the trillions of dollars going into renewable energies, the problem is several more trillion of dollars of taxpayer money are going into fossil fuel subsidies today, right? That's the reality, and that's what we need to call out. So to your question, again, the most important thing I want to say is that what tactics you choose to use in any struggle must always be determined by the contextual reality that you find yourself in, right? So I don't want to be prescriptive in that way. That's the most important. As an example, let's take a civil disobedience action, right? Are people familiar what's mooning? Mooning. So mooning is like, say, 15 of us get together, on our bum cheeks, we'll write one letter, S-T-O-P, and we stand in public, we all pull our pants down, and we turn around and they say, stop climate change, right? It's very effective if you're in San Francisco, New York, and London maybe. It's not going to work so well in Sana'a or in Baghdad or in Saudi Arabia. It doesn't mean then that mooning is a bad thing per se. It just means you have to be thoughtful about where you deploy different tactics. But the other tool that we have to get better at is, and Ghaith kind of took us there a little bit, is the whole digital space. Today, sadly, mainstream media is on a decline, right? Partly, by the way, I must say, some of the titles that we respected, even those of us who live in the global south, like BBC, for example, we had our criticisms of BBC, but we thought that, there was an element of fairness about them. But that credibility after the genocide in Gaza has completely gone for most of us from the global south. We do not take the BBC seriously anymore because they've shown that they can be as complicit in one of the worst human crimes that we've ever seen on this planet. So we have to, and I don't have the skills, I don't know, but I know there are a lot of people who are trying to figure out, understanding what are the things, the communications channels that are reaching people. And yeah, let me just end with this reflection. You'll be shocked to know Steve Bannon, one of Trump's biggest ideologues, do you know one of his biggest intellectual guides for his strategy was an Italian socialist called Antonio Gramsci. So Gramsci talked about getting, the way you get hegemony or control over a society is by understanding that people are not homogeneous, that you need to understand the different cultural impulses in a society and be able to respond to each of those pulses. In 2016 election, you know that Facebook micro-targeting was classical Gramscian kind of approach, right? You go, so basically, I would say, in conclusion, we need to look at what everybody is doing. Because quite frankly, the ultra-right in the last 2 decades have shown significantly more skill and capability than people who call themselves liberal, progressive, left, or whatever that we wish to call ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you.
Questions?
Yep. Hi, thank you for your discussion. Something that your point about extinction, about if we do nothing, humans will go extinct and the problem will solve itself, is, I think, part of the, maybe 1% of the world has the resources to not be so affected by climate change. I think of the 0.1% in America. Sorry, I'll hold it right by my mouth. Part of the world is not so affected by climate change, like the Pacific Islands versus, let's say, Canada is a huge difference. What ways do you think there are to put pressure on the 0.1% that see climate change as a theoretical problem, but know cynically that it's not going to ruin their lives? They might have to relocate from Florida to somewhere else that's better off, but it will take a long, long time for them to have nowhere on Earth to live, if that makes sense.
Very good question. Any more questions? Natalia, please.
Kumi, something that you said earlier about individual approach and explaining to a farmer was right at this point, but explaining to an individual that, this is about your child and so on. How does that fit into what seems to be a problem with making individuals responsible for big systemic failures, which is really overwhelming? And it seems to be the case in climate. It's the same thing with tech and AI. Is that an issue in the activism world? If you could address that, I'm curious. What do you think?
So it's a very good question. How do we, the 1%, make them feel?
Okay, we've got 21 seconds left. So please talk to me later for deeper answers. But I think that all these questions lead us to the biggest myth in the room and the biggest myth in the world right now. And that is that the countries that call themselves democracies are actually democracies, right? So I just want to end with this quick story. After Tanzania got independence, an American delegation of policymakers, journalists, and so on came to, as they would, to see how the natives were doing, right? So when they get there, Nyerere welcomes them. Julius Nyerere, one of the wonderful, clean, never went corrupt presidents that led the liberation struggle. And one of the journalists puts up his hand and says, President Nyerere, don't you think it's a contradiction that you all said that you were fighting against colonialism for democracy, and now you'll ended up with a one-party state? So Nyerere says, that's a really fair question. Let me just say that when our people had to take on the might of the British colonial state, that was 1,000,000 times stronger than us militarily, 1,000,000 times stronger than us financially, 1,000,000 times, stronger than us in terms of the control of communications apparatus, we had to unite the people under one banner to give us some chance. But don't worry, we're in a consolidation period. Political parties would eventually merge. Then he says, but I'm surprised that you as an American journalist are asking me this question. So the guy says, what do you mean? He said, well, when we look at Europe, notwithstanding all the crimes that Europe committed against the African people through genocides in the Congo, slavery, colonialism, and the list is much longer, the one thing Nyerere said I'll give the Europeans credit for is that, and he was talking about Western Europe at that point, that any country you went to, there was at least one party that was explicitly standing up for the working class, and there's one party that was explicitly standing for the capitalist class. He said, when I look at the United States, both your parties are explicitly standing up not for the working people, but for the wealthiest Americans. So in that case, he said, the United States is also a one-party state, but in typical American extravagance, you'll have two of them, right? So, of course, right now, there's a little more of a distinction between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, but understand, the failure of democracy, the failure to act on climate change is because the so-called progressive parties, Labour Party, blah, 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 they have been as complicit in terms of supporting fossil fuels, supporting oligarchs, supporting the most wealthiest interests and undermining the interests of the working class. And to address all of these issues, we need to breathe new life into what we understand by democracy and recognize that today what we have in the world, almost nowhere in the world do we have democracy. All we have is liberal oligarchies with the form of democracy without the content of democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.